The life and times of George Albert Smith are not particularly well known. Despite working for several years as a stage hypnotist and psychic, the owner of a popular pleasure park, and then, eventually, a pioneering inventor and filmmaker, there are few who could reel off a biography based on nothing more than a name. Perhaps even more obscure, however, was his time spent as a ghost hunter for the Society for Psychical Research, which, whilst a relatively short career in comparison, was no less groundbreaking when he took tenancy of a haunted house for more than a whole year in order to investigate the reported phenomena. This is Dark Histories, where the facts are worse than fiction. Hello and welcome to Dark Histories Season 8, Episode 19. I'm Ben, your host as always, and this week I've got a really exciting episode, or an episode that I'm really excited to have worked on and to bring to you guys, because it's set in, for the most part, it's set in my hometown of Brighton, which it instantly just makes the research just that little bit more fun when you find little bits of pieces that you realise that, oh, actually, I've drunk in that pub, or, things like that. It's really interesting. So anyway, on that note, I did make a little sort of, supplemental video film type thing that I'll be uploading to Patreon. So if you're a member, keep an eye out for that. It is a little bit weather dependent at the moment. I've got a couple more places that I want to film at, but the weather has turned from like the last days of summer, which were beautiful, to storming. So look out for that on Monday or Tuesday, hopefully at the latest. But that's just a little bit of fun. Anyway, let's get on with this. This episode is called The Ghost Hunts of George Albert Smith, Mesmerist and Filmmaker. Born in Cripplegate, just north of the Thames in the City of London, on the 4th of January 1864, George Albert Smith led a fairly quiet early life. It was quiet enough, at least, to have left little record. By the age of 17, though, things began to change, and quite rapidly at that. In 1881, he moved to the burgeoning seaside town of Brighton and Hove, where his mother ran a boarding house on Grand Parade, a stone's throw away from the beach. At the time, the town of Brighton was in its boom. In the late 18th and early 19th century, the Prince Regent had built the eccentric palace, the Royal Pavilion, and doctors recommending seaside air had popularised it as a healthy retreat for fashionable Londoners who flowed into the town via the direct rail line that was completed in 1841. By the time that George arrived, it was firmly established as one of England's biggest and most exciting towns, complete with 2 piers, an electric railway to cart visitors up and down the promenade, the world's largest aquarium that was the host to a roof terrace, a fernery, a reading room and daily organ recitals, and a host of theatres and stages. The aquarium showcased acts from around the world. Already interested in the world of spiritualism and the associated supernormal sciences that surrounded such beliefs, it turned out it would be these stages that would hold the greatest draw for George. And soon after he moved to Brighton, he began performing as a mesmerist, specialising in the dark arts of thought reading. One advert from a local paper boasted of his mirth-provoking experiments on the audience. George's act seemed to do well enough, and after some moderate local success, he teamed up with Douglas Blackburn, a journalist and editor of the local rag The Brightonian, to create a double act wherein George would place a blindfold over his eyes and then guide Blackburn to an object that had apparently been hidden away. So far, so true. The audience, however, were unaware that it was Blackburn himself who had done the hiding. Despite its fairly crude design, the act proved a hit, and the two performed regularly to audiences in the Brighton Aquarium, and Blackburn wrote to the spiritualist paper, Light, to describe how he and George had managed to develop the powers of thought transference. In conjunction with Mr. G.A. Smith, a Brighton mesmerist, not unknown to readers of this and other spiritualist journals, I have had the satisfaction of experiencing some demonstrations of mind sympathy which are, I believe, almost without precedent. The modus of Smith's experiment is this. He places himself en rapport with myself by taking my hands, and a strong concentration of will and mental vision on my part has enabled him to read my thoughts with an accuracy that approaches the miraculous. Not only can he with slight hesitation read numbers, words, and even whole sentences which I alone have seen, but the sympathy between us has been developed to such a degree that he rarely fails to experience the taste of any liquid or solid I choose to imagine. He has named, described, or discovered small articles that he has never seen, when they have been concealed by me in the most unusual places, and on 2 occasions he has successfully described portions of a scene which I either imagined or actually saw. Mr. Smith has exhibited marked power as a thought reader through the mediumship of other persons, but on no occasion has he attained to anything like the power he invariably displays when en rapport with myself. Blackburn then went on to invite any spiritualist or scientific inquirer to pay them a visit, which was a fairly bold move, really, especially since he'd been one of the designers of what was a complete hoax. His call didn't seem to go amiss, however, and a year later, with the founding of the Society for Psychical Research, George became central to their investigations into hypnotism and thought transference. George got so involved with the group that he actually became the private secretary of Edmund Gurney, the Society's honorary secretary, assisting him in setting up, carrying out and documenting the results of a series of experiments in hypnotism. It was a post that he held until 1888, when Gurney died in a room at the Royal Albion Hotel in Brighton after accidentally overdosing on chloroform, which he'd been using as a treatment for neuralgia, though some believed it to have been suicide after he had been disillusioned with his experiments. It was about this time that George met Laura Bailey. Another seaside performer, Laura had had a successful career, both as an actor and a musician. Her life had begun on the stage as part of a family singing group involving herself and her 3 sisters, and she quickly grew into the life of a performer, taking on starring roles in pantomimes such as Aladdin, Robinson Crusoe and Robin Hood. Thriving in these comedic roles, she made a strong name for herself across the South Coast and beyond. In 1887, at the Pier Pavilion in Hastings, 35 miles east along the coast from Brighton, a show was put together to celebrate the careers of the Bailey sisters, inviting entertainers from all areas to take part, including George Albert Smith, who by now was being described as one of the youngest, but at the same time one of the cleverest hypnotists around. Whatever happened at the event, the two obviously took a liking to one another, and within a year of the show, George and Laura had married on the 13th of June 1888. Laura continued to entertain with her sisters, but George had by now grown tired of his own act, and instead he began tinkering with inventions. In particular, he had developed a rather keen interest in the fledgling field of cinema. A few years after their marriage, George had purchased the lease for a public park in Brighton's neighbouring town of Hove, known as St Anne's Well Gardens, and with Laura's help, George transformed what had previously been an early spa centred around a spring with public gardens into a full-fledged public pleasure park, complete with a monkey house, tightrope walkers, open-air theatre, a fortune teller, and perhaps, of most importance to George, a magic lantern where he presented slideshows to enraptured audience members. When he wasn't projecting images and when the weather permitted, he put on hot air balloon exhibitions with parachute jumpers that leapt from the basket. In the background, however, George was working on other projects. In particular, he had grown intensely interested in filmmaking, and it eventually culminated in him converting the pump room of his residence into a dark room where he could process film reel, much of which he shot in St Anne's Well Gardens itself. Before long, he, along with 3 other Brighton filmmakers, James Williamson, Alfred Darling and Esme Collins, had established what would eventually come to be known as the Brighton School of Filmmaking. George was not your average Victorian filmmaker. Almost definitely influenced by his previous work with illusions and trick photography, he pioneered in many areas of cinematography, including the use of double exposure, close-ups and narrative editing, where, utilising his wife's acting experience in pantomime, he put together some of the earliest works of cinematic comedy. Laura too got in on the act, often directing and shooting films herself, though they would generally end up credited to George. It's fair to say that by the end of the Victorian period, George had already lived a fairly impressive, interesting and varied life. It's not surprising, therefore, that his successes as an entertainer, inventor and cinematographer did overshadow one other area of his life, that of George Albert Smith, the ghost hunter. During his days in the Society for Psychical Research, George had been involved with more than just experiments in hypnotism. and though they're far less well remembered than his other accomplishments, they too would go on to be fairly groundbreaking in their own way. George Albert Smith's first documented foray into ghost hunting actually happened way back in 1884, just a year after his joining the Society of Psychical Research. After a clerk from Norwich contacted a member of the society, George was handed the case to investigate. He made the 180-mile journey from Brighton to Norwich in November of that year, arriving on the 22nd, where his first port of call was to question the mysterious clerk, who, in all documentation, was simply called Mr. X. At first glance, George thought that he was an exceedingly intelligent witness, that he also found him to have somewhat nervous and excitable temperament, though he did concede that that may have been due to the nature of the question in itself, rather than his standard manner. Recently married, the clerk laid out his story for George, that he'd returned from his honeymoon with his wife and taken up residence in a newly purchased house around June of 1884. It wasn't long before they started to notice unusual sounds, but at first they attributed them to natural occurrences. As time drew on, however, when Mr. and Mrs. X were in their bedroom at night, tramping sounds like people occupying the sitting room that they had just left were heard. The handle of the door at the foot of the stairs was once or twice unmistakably tried, and sounds of footsteps mounting the stairs were heard. When the sounds continued night after night, around the same time between 10 and 12 midnight, and with no cause that could be found, the couple concluded that the house must simply have been haunted by a haunt. They were further convinced when, soon after, the window in their bedroom was broken, forcing them to take up in the spare room. It was here where the clerk was allegedly presented with what he considered undeniable truth, when he saw the figure of a man standing motionless at the foot of the bed. The figure was what he described as a respectable old gentleman of about 60 with sharp, well-marked features. He was dressed in a black coat and waistcoat and did nothing during the time that he was visible. He simply stared at the clerk, with no other movement or emotion, until finally he raised his arms and sank through the floor. This sighting led to a long 4 months of unexplained phenomena occurring in the house, which worked away at the clerk's nerves, until he was, eventually, unable to walk through the house alone. Within this time, footsteps on the kitchen stairs were reported, both by the clerk and his servants, along with a detached vocal sound that seemed to float through the house, though one servant noted that these sometimes seemed to get mixed together with a coughing noise from the old woman living in the house next door. The final straw came for Mr. X in September, when his wife had been taking tea in the rear room of the ground floor alongside the servant and a young girl who had been taking painting classes, when they heard what they described as a series of disembodied sighs coming from a chair perched by the window. The sighs were said to have sounded as if they were coming from a strong man in great bodily and mental anguish. The unexplained noises paused for a few moments before a final moan floated out across the room, leaving all 3 witnesses petrified by what they had heard. They left the house as soon as they regained their composure. When Mr. X returned from work that evening, he found the house locked up and his wife at a friend's house refusing to return. With some work, he managed to talk her to going back to the house with him, but shortly after, the clerk himself, whilst upstairs washing his hands, heard what he described as a woman's whisper, saying, "Hark, the master of the house has returned, we must depart." This was followed by footsteps and then a long series of crying sounds, as if coming from a female in deep distress. The next morning, the couple left the house to stay with a friend and found a new house 2 weeks later, leaving their old house empty. After having heard this story from the clerk, George took it upon himself to visit the house for himself, arriving at 10 p.m. and staying until midnight. It is a very tiny place and consists of a basement, a ground floor, and first floor. The kitchen is a little better than a cellar, and although the house is not at all old, its construction is not of a modern kind. The street door opens right into the front room, and no space is lost in unnecessary passages or landings. The foot of the staircase, which leads to the first floor, is right in the back ground floor room. The house is semi-detached and has a garden in front and a yard at the back, which is separated from the side road by a brick wall. One of the first notes that George took was how noises from the house next door were plainly audible through the joining wall, which accounted for all of the sounds he heard during his 2-hour visit, including the sound of the footsteps up and down the stairs, the sound of them poking their fire, and the sound of passers-by in the street outside. There were some creaks and groans that he heard, which he couldn't pinpoint, but he attributed them to the normal sounds of any house, should one listen out for them. Overall, it was a somewhat disappointing first ghost hunt for George. He submitted that the testimony had been strong, and due to the emphatic way that it had been told to him by the witness, had to have either been completely true or a matter of self-deception to what he called a considerable extent. When he spoke to the neighbours, most seemed to believe that the apparition story from Mr. X was nothing more than a dream, whilst George himself admitted that all the sounds he had heard had been perfectly explainable, and likely very similar to what Mr. and Mrs. X had heard. He also concluded that within their repeated retelling of the story, he felt that it had somehow grown in the minds of Mr. and Mrs. X, becoming more vivid with each retelling. George left Norwich, decidedly underwhelmed by his experience, the house itself left to its empty rooms. But it was his next documented ghost hunt, however, that would go on to make psychical research history. George's second documented ghost hunt would begin in August of 1888, but the phenomena he was there to investigate had begun 6 years earlier, when the house had been occupied by a Miss L. Morris and her aunt, beginning in October of 1882. Miss Morris's tenancy was a fairly busy one. She'd moved into the house alongside her aunt and maidservant, and from time to time her 2 sisters would come to visit, both staying for extended periods. The events that she experienced whilst living at the house led her to eventually write to the Society in June of 1888, 2 years after she had moved out. Initially, the case was investigated by Edward Gurney, but his unfortunate death by chloroform overdose happened just a week after his first meeting with Mrs. Morris, and so the case was handed over to Frank Podmore, an author who had gained an interest in spiritualism during his time studying at Oxford. In his earliest reports on his meeting with Miss Morris, Gurney described her as having a manner devoid of exaggeration and superstition, and overall he saw her as an excellent witness who had nothing to gain from her experience in the house and a fair amount to lose, financially or otherwise. The house, located just north of the bustling train station in George's hometown of Brighton, was an average townhouse with a bay window on the ground floor and nestled amongst a fairly unassuming terrace. There were 4 steps leading off the street up to its front door, and more beside headed down to the basement. A black iron railing separated the front of the house from the street directly outside. Inside the house, the ground floor was predominantly occupied by a large front room, a rear bedroom that overlooked the small basement garden, and a small second bedroom. Upstairs housed a small servants' room and 2 larger bedrooms overlooking the street in the front and the garden in the rear. In the basement sat the breakfast room in the front, with the kitchen and wash house in the rear leading out into the garden. It wasn't long before Mrs. Morris experienced strange happenings. In fact, by the end of the first day of her tenancy, in October of 1882, she had heard disembodied footsteps pacing around the drawing room table. They had arrived at the house later in the day and spent most of the evening arranging the furniture. It was 9:45 p.m. when things turned from a happy, jovial atmosphere to something more concerning. I happened to be alone in the front drawing room when, for the first time in my life, I heard, without seeing anyone, heavy footsteps tramping around the drawing room table at which I was reading. Naturally, I was surprised, as I'd never read or believed in anything supernatural. A few minutes later, my eldest sister comes and sits by my side, and when suddenly she exclaims, turning pale, "There is someone who has got into the house, walking about upstairs. I heard such a noise, like a door banging to." The sisters stopped still and listened for more noises, before Miss Morris declared that she would grab the fire poker, whilst her sister should grab the lantern, and that they would head upstairs to investigate. Not as keen as her sister, she declined the offer, saying that she was too afraid, and so Miss Morris headed up alone, searching through the rooms, but she found nothing. That night, whilst laying in bed, she heard footsteps walking throughout the house, clambering up and down the stairs for so long that she barely slept, being startled awake on several occasions. Each time that she woke, she lit a candle and shone the dim light out into the hall beyond the door, but saw no one. Putting it down to noises from the neighbouring property, she eventually got back into bed and did her best to ignore the disembodied sounds for the rest of the night. It was, all told, a fairly harrowing introduction to her new house, and for several weeks she heard footsteps night after night, until she said eventually she simply got used to the noises and they faded into the background of the house, which allowed her to ignore them as best she could. That was until 3 weeks later, when an incident occurred that she was unable to ignore. It was about 5 o'clock one afternoon in November, and so light that I had no need of the gas to enable me to read clearly some music that I was practicing, and which engrossed my whole attention and thought. Having forgotten some new waltzes that I had laid on the music shelf in the back drawing room, I left the piano and went dancing gaily along, singing a song as I went, when suddenly there stood before me, preventing me getting the music, the figure of a woman, heavily robed in deepest black from head to her feet. Her face was intensely sad and deadly pale. There she stood, gazing fixedly at me. Whether it was the shock of seeing someone in the house, Miss Morris let out a small exclamation, calling out, "Oh, Auntie, I thought it was you," at which point the apparition vanished. Shaking and confused, she walked back to her piano, closed the lid, and then bounded upstairs to find her auntie, who, now looking just as confused as her niece, was sitting alone in her room. Not wishing to alarm her aunt, nor to be made fun of, Miss Morris chose to keep what she had seen to herself, and the two made their way back downstairs. Thankfully for Miss Norris, it would be over 18 months before she would experience anything so disturbing again. This time, it was in June of 1884, and by now the footsteps in the house had become so ingrained into their living experiences that by and large Miss Morris and her aunt had both learnt to ignore them completely. In summer of 84, though, a new nuisance began when the doorbell started to ring incessantly, with no one ever being at the door to press the button. We had always put it down to a runaway ring and took no notice, but for 3 weeks, at intervals of a quarter of an hour or half an hour, it rang incessantly, and such peals that it electrified us. We put ourselves on guard and carefully watched, believing it a trick. We had everyone up from the basement out of connection with the wire in the front drawing room, and placed the hall door and our doors wide open. It was the same result, loud and piercing peals from the bell, which at last, after 3 weeks, we had taken off, when we saw the wire in connection with it vibrated as if the bell was still attached to it. There were also loud knocks at the door, and no one was there when we went to answer, and I repeatedly heard loud knocks at my own room door the whole time I was in the house. Looking for an explanation, Miss Morris had the floorboards pulled up from around the house, hoping to find some kind of malfunction or break in the cabling that might have been setting the bell off, but she found nothing unusual or untoward. Around the same time, both Miss Morris and her aunt had begun noticing that doors were opening and closing throughout the house on their own accord, and at times they even witnessed the handles turning whilst no one else seemed to be around. Once more, the next big event didn't happen for well over a year, in the winter of 1885, when Miss Morris seemed to witness the apparition of the same woman as before, dressed in black robes, gliding down the hall in the basement. Shortly after the sighting, Miss Morris's aunt passed away from what was apparently a long-suffering illness, and looking to move on from her grief, she chose to end her tenancy and move out of the house. She later heard rumours that a woman had reportedly hung herself in the house, which seemed to act as confirmation as to everything she had experienced whilst living there. This was a rumour that, actually, turned out to be quite true, and confirmed in a newspaper article from the Sussex Advertiser published on the 5th of April 1879 that reported on the inquest of a previous tenant, 42-year-old Miss Mary Ann Farmer, who had hanged herself with a skipping rope tied over the door of the upstairs back bedroom following a long spate of financial struggles. It was perhaps fortunate that Miss Morris only learned of this after she had moved out, given the struggles she suffered whilst living there. Following the departure of Miss Morris, the house remained empty for 11 months before the next tenant, a Mrs. Clara Gilby, a recent widow after her husband had died in the army, and her 2 daughters, aged 9 and 11 years old, moved in along with their maidservant, Miss Anne Holden, and their 2 cats and a pet dog. This was in November of 1887. As they made themselves at home in their new surroundings, they were each one completely unaware of the previous happenings going on within the walls, and so were appropriately shocked, some 2 weeks after taking the keys, to have been awoken late one night by what Mrs. Gilby described as a deep sob and a moan. "Oh," I thought, "what has happened to the children?" I rushed in, their room being at the back of mine, and found them sleeping soundly. So back to bed I went, when again another sob, and such a thump of somebody or something very heavy. I sat up in bed, looked all around the room, then to my horror, a voice, a very sweet one, said, "Oh, do forgive me," 3 times. Terrified, Mrs. Gilby leapt out of bed and grabbed her gaslight from the bedside table, turning it up to illuminate the room and rushing to the maid's bedroom, where she found the maid fast asleep. Shaking her, she asked her to accompany her back to her room, and the pair crept downstairs and settled in to see if they could listen for the sounds once more, the orange glow of the gaslight now bouncing from the dimly lit walls. In 5 minutes, the sobs and moans recommenced, and the heavy tramping of feet and such thumps like heavy boxes of plate being thrown about. The maid suggested that I should ring the bell I always keep in my room, but I did not like to alarm the neighbourhood. I told her to go to bed, and hearing nothing for half an hour, I got into mine, nearly frozen with cold and fright. As soon as Mrs. Gilby had gotten into bed, however, the sobs and moans began again, leading her to call the maid once more. 3 times that night she called upon Anne to come and listen, but each time the same cycle repeated of peace and disruption. The following morning, Mrs. Gilby decided to keep the occurrence between herself and the maid, choosing not to upset her children, though it seems that they too had been made aware of something out of the ordinary going on, as they routinely heard crashes and strange noises, and rarely wanted to sleep alone. With her husband's recent death, however, Mrs. Gilby just had too much to deal with, what was settling all of his affairs, that she said she simply had too little time to actually think, and so life continued in the small house in a relative calm. That changed one day shortly after, when Mrs. Gilby was sitting alone in the drawing room, rifling through a stack of business papers, when she was startled by the piercing scream of one of her daughters. Rushing to see what was wrong, she was met by the maid and both children, one of which, deathly white and struggling to breathe, told her that whilst she had been playing with the dog, she had seen the pale face of a strange woman looking around the corner of her door. Struggling to think of a good cover to calm her children, Mrs. Gilby told them that it had just been someone playing a trick with a magic lantern, but it only had limited success, and for several months after that, neither child would walk around the house alone. For the rest of December, right up until New Year's, Mrs. Gilby heard banging throughout the nights, and eventually, on the 29th of December, after feeling her own bed shake, she could bear it no longer, and she invited a string of guests to stay in order that she not be in the house alone. Eventually, after she had run out of guests willing to sleep over, she inquired with the patrolling policeman. Unfortunately, the policeman had a less than sympathetic ear, and only told her that he didn't believe in ghosts and that he could not spend his time catching whatever it was that had been frightening her and her children. By now, Mrs. Gilby had been burning her gas lamp at full power all night long in an effort to light the house throughout the dark winter nights, and her sleep and overall health was becoming severely affected. Over the following months, all members of the house experienced a series of strange noises and events. One of the children said that she had seen a skirt hanging from the ceiling of her bedroom, whilst the other said she heard the bedroom door open one night, footsteps walk up to their bed, which shook violently for a few moments before ceasing, and then the footsteps walk back out again. Similarly, one evening, both the children and the maid heard footsteps approach the piano in the drawing room, played 2 notes, and then walk back out. By March, Mrs. Gilby was suffering quite badly and had already twice threatened to leave the house. Now, though, a new nuisance was taking place, and just like with the previous tenancy, the doorbell had begun ringing at random times, and seemingly with no one having activated the cable. Seeking affirmation that she wasn't going crazy, Mrs. Gilby began seeking out previous tenants, hoping to ask them if they too had suffered any strange happenings. At first she was met only with negative responses, but then she spoke with Miss Morris, who, happy to relinquish some of the secrets that she'd been holding onto for so many years, told her all about her experiences seeing the black-robed lady in the house. Although these stories must have been somewhat unnerving to hear, Mrs. Gilby admitted that finally meeting someone that not only believed her stories but actively backed them up was something of a relief. Whether or not it helped her nerves is another matter altogether, and with the strange events continuing, she certainly didn't need any outside influence making matters worse. Over the following weeks, she heard on several occasions the voice of a woman calling out around the house, with the maid, the children and Mrs. Gilby all hearing it at different times and confusing it for one another, only to confirm that no one had spoken. Then, to top it all off, Mrs. Gilby saw the apparition of a woman, seemingly dressed in white, in the doorway outside the small upstairs bedroom. This was finally enough to push her over the edge, and she visited the landlord to ask to be released from their contract so that she could leave the house immediately. Unfortunately, the landlord was less than keen on this idea and told her in no uncertain terms that it would be simply impossible unless she was willing to pay the remainder of her 9 months' rent. Financially tied, Miss Gilby resolved herself to stay in the house throughout the summer months, when she would leave the tenancy early, come the autumn, which would leave herself only a few months' rent to pay for the release. Sadly, the summer months, though lighter in the evenings, would prove to be no less terrifying, a point firmly hammered home when she returned to the house one day to find one of the children pale and rigid, terrified stiff. When she asked what was wrong, the child said that she had seen the same face as before looking around her door, only this time she had seen the whole figure of a woman crawling in the little room as if to spring on her. Fearing for her child's safety, she took them to see a doctor and then headed to London, where she stayed with friends for several weeks, leaving the maid at home with her father to take care of the empty house. 2 weeks into her stay, however, she received a letter from the maid saying that she could no longer stay in the house. Her father had already left after he had felt something breathing in his face. Her little sister and mother had come as a replacement, but all three had decided to leave after hearing footsteps for a series of nights, culminating in a loud knock on the bedroom door, after which she lay in bed, terrified to hear footsteps walk throughout her bedroom as furniture pushed and moved out of the way, all by itself. Later that same night, she saw a shadow, which she described, "It seemed all in a heap. It went right along the window and shaded right along the wall opposite." The servant had left enough food down to feed the cats and dog and hightailed it out of the house, locking it up behind her to take refuge elsewhere. This was the final straw for Mrs. Gilby, who returned to Brighton, packed her things, and wrote to her landlord, insisting that she is leaving. Within a week, she was free from the house, which, once more, stood empty, waiting for its next tenants. By now, the small terraced house had grown quite a reputation within Brighton, and having heard the rumours that the place was haunted, 3 men visited the house, hoping to catch whatever ghost was supposedly walking the halls. Far from any psychical researches, these sleuths were apparently 3 well-to-do gentlemen, seeking to satisfy their own curiosities. A barrister, a solicitor, and a reverend, they managed to visit the house twice, though neither for more than a few hours at a time. Their first visit, on the 23rd of May 1888, was disturbed by the usual bell ringing and thumping sounds, whilst their second visit, 5 days later, on the 28th of May, was graced with a vision of what they referred to as the dress of a supermaterial being. On the second visit, the Reverend apparently carried out what he called prayers of exorcism. Despite their fairly action-packed few hours in the house, their testimonies were relatively short at the time, possibly thanks to the short shrift that the investigating member of the Society for Psychical Research, Frank Podmore, gave to their experiences. Partially this was due to the short time that they spent inside the house, but partially it was due to the fact that they entered the house with expectations shaped by the full knowledge of the previous events. Nevertheless, the case was kicking up quite a fuss in the psychical research world. The fact that 2 independent groups, that of the family of Miss Morris and the family of Miss Gilby, both had had parallel experiences inside the house long before they met and spoke to one another to discuss what they had seen and heard. And so it was that George Albert Smith, along with his wife Laura, moved into the now vacant house, using funds from the Society for Psychical Research in order to carry out a prolonged, sustained investigation. George and Laura moved into the Brighton house on the 17th of August of 1888, just 2 months after their wedding, with one maidservant joining them several weeks later. As in his earlier investigation, George wrote of the house in pragmatic tones, and he had begun taking notes as soon as he entered. Within the first lines of his report, he was keen to point out the proximity of the train station to the house, and of how the sounds of the engines coming and going could be clearly heard from its position high on the hill. This was especially pronounced on a stormy day, he said, where quite intricate sounds could make their way up to the house, including the voices of the workmen wavering on the wind. Throughout his stay in the house, he kept a fastidious diary, writing down all disturbances he experienced, which began just 3 days after their arrival. It was the 20th of August when Laura heard what she thought to be a pail being rattled in the small room at the top of the stairs. Alerted to the noise, they went to see what could be causing the sound, but they found nothing. It was a relatively calm start to the investigation, but would more or less signal what they should come to expect for the next year. A week later, the doorbell began ringing, just as it had before, though on one occasion George was quick enough to discover 2 children running away. This continued throughout the tenancy, though it was only on this singular occasion that any children were caught carrying out the prank, and on all other occasions no one was found to be ringing the bell. Later that month, while sitting at his writing desk at around 8:15 in the evening, George heard a tapping sound coming from the room above, which he described as a person tapping on the floor with a hammer, using about as much force to drive tacks in. Grabbing his lantern, he bounded up the stairs, but found no one present in any of the rooms, with Laura being out at the time and the maidservant busy at work in the kitchen on the basement level. It was on the 13th of October that the footsteps made their return. The maidservant had been lying in bed when she had heard them creep up and down the stairs and shuffle around outside her door. Interestingly, George noted that the neighbouring house was, at the time, unoccupied, which ruled out any sound travelling through the connecting wall. A month later, George wrote the longest entry into his journal so far. December the 9th, 1888. I was in the house alone, writing at my desk. Time 8:30. Suddenly, I heard a noise which seemed to come from the hall outside my room door. I can only compare the sound to that which would be made if half a brick were tied to a piece of string and jerked about over the linoleum, as one might jerk a reel to make a kitten playful. The bumping noise seemed to commence close to the door of the room in which I was sitting. It appeared to proceed along the passage to the top of the kitchen stairs, traversing a distance of some 15 feet in about half a dozen jumps. And then it seemed to turn to the staircase corner and to jump down 3 or 4 stairs, one at a time. I went out carrying my reading lamp with me, but nothing I could find, either in the passage or down the kitchen stairs. Puzzled by these sounds, George returned to his work at his desk, turning it over in his mind whilst he continued writing. It was no good, though. Within 5 minutes, the strange knocking sounds began once again, back on the kitchen stairs, precisely where they had left off before. Jumping out of his seat quickly, George rushed out into the hallway and reached the top of the stairs just in time to hear everything descend once more into silence. Standing there in the dark, not having had time to snatch up his lantern, he began to back down the stairs, heading into the kitchen. Reaching the bottom, I stepped into the kitchen and turned up the gas there, but nowhere was anything to be seen that could have caused these curious sounds. More perplexed still, I returned once more to my writing, but had scarcely shut the sitting room door and settled myself at the desk when 3 sharp thumps sounded on the floor just outside the door. I sprang across the room and threw the door open, and nothing was to be seen. It appeared that things were beginning to heat up in the house as the cold winter drew tight around the investigators. Within a week, George found himself writing his second lengthy entry. December the 15th, 1888. A most remarkable and inexplicable noise occurred at 11:35 p.m. on this day. Our bedroom, adjoining the sitting room, was separated from it by curtains. Across one corner of the sitting room, one of the corners adjoining the bedroom, a piano was placed, and over this instrument, upon the wall, hung a guitar. The guitar, as most people are aware, has 6 strings, 3 silver and 3 gut. On this night, I had retired before my wife and had been in bed about 5 minutes. She remained in the sitting room in order to say her prayers by the fire, as it was a very cold night. In the midst of the quietness which ensued, I suddenly heard the guitar play. Pung, pang, ping, pung, pang, ping. Here, my wife called out in a loud, awe-struck whisper, "Did you hear that?" Whilst even as she spoke, a third pung, pang, ping sounded clearly through the rooms. I immediately sprang out of bed and rushed into her, finding her kneeling upon the hearth rug by an armchair, staring with astonishment at the guitar upon the wall. No more sounds were heard, though we sat waiting by the fire for over half an hour. My wife said that when the guitar sounded its chords, in arpeggio, for the second and third time, she was looking straight at the instrument, and such critical observation as she had at command under the surprise of the thing satisfied her that there was nothing visible near it, and that it made no perceptible movement. George and Laura both tried to reason this mysterious guitar playing away, suggesting that perhaps the tuning pegs had slipped, ringing the strings as they snapped round, though they had to admit that it was fairly improbable that all 3 strings should sound one after another with such a perfect interval if it had just been a random slip of a tuning peg, and certainly not 3 times in quick succession. In any case, the following day, when George had built the courage to check over the guitar in the light of day, he found it perfectly in tune. This was not the only incidence of a guitar playing musical notes either. A month later, in the new year, Laura heard the guitar play a long, pronounced note, with no one being anywhere near it. Not knowing how to play the guitar, she found the note on the piano and played it back to George when he came home later that evening, which he found corresponded precisely with the middle string of the guitar, though now the instrument appeared to be out of tune, despite not being touched, since the sounds played a month prior. It sounded a third time, this time when the house was empty, George, Laura and the maidservant having gone into town, leaving a single visitor behind. George was adamant in his notes that the visitor had no knowledge that the guitar had made similar sounds in the past. Sadly, aside from these musical notes and a few unexplained sounds, neither George nor Laura experienced anything else untowards during their time in the house. They left the tenancy on the 27th September 1889, having stayed just over 13 months, concluding that they had failed to see any startling visual experiences, but conceding that they had been certainly confronted with a few odd noises, of a sort which would undoubtedly have arrested attention in any house, no matter whether it had ghostly reputation or not. On the 13th of March 1890, the latest tenant wrote to the Society for Psychical Research to inform them that they had so far been thoroughly disappointed in the ghost, which had seemingly gone completely quiet. This letter drew to an end the Society's interest in the house, leaving its unassuming frontage to blend back into the anonymous terraces of Brighton, its unusual history to be long forgotten in the Society's archives. The case was reintroduced to the public in 1905 when the Daily Mail picked it up for a story, within which they, unsurprisingly, butchered it for the sake of sensationalism, sketching George as a heroic mountain climber and writing the story as if it were far more recent than it actually was. George, for the record, was unimpressed by the article. In 1904, George Albert Smith left Brighton, having given up the lease of St Answell Gardens, moving to the small town of Southwick, 5 miles to the west, where he gave himself to his inventing work. His best claim to fame being the invention of kinemacolour, the first successful process to capture colour images on motion picture film, which was unveiled to the public in 1909. He was instituted as a Fellow in the British Film Academy in 1955, 4 years before his death on the 17th of May 1959 at 95 years of age. Laura having passed away 21 years prior at the age of 76. These days, George and Laura are far better known for their contribution to the early film industry. Although his ghost hunts were relatively unspectacular, his Brighton investigation is exceptional on 2 grounds. Firstly, that within the Society for Psychical Research's records, the house is still considered one of very few cases that were of genuine interest. And secondly, that his 13-month live-in investigation was the very first of its kind, decades before similar, much more famous cases, such as Borley Rectory actually rented a house simply in order to study it. It seems that George and Laura, no matter what they turned their hands to, were true pioneers, both having lived a fascinating life, from the boards of theatres to the musty halls of haunted homes, and in the scented gardens of St Anne's Well, where they brought entertainment to the masses, leaving a legacy that still stands today, though their names are perhaps often unknown. So that was the story of George Albert Smith and his wife Laura. I think they're both fantastic, and there's a little bit to talk about after these short advert breaks. Today's episode is sponsored by BetterHelp. What's something that you'd love to learn as an adult? Do you make time to learn new things as often as you'd like? Or was that all lost in childhood? Kids are always learning and growing, but as adults, sometimes we lose that curiosity. And sometimes we just don't have the time, or the motivation can be a struggle when you've got so much else going on in your mind. What's something that you would like to learn? Gardening, a new language, or maybe how to finally beat your best friend in bowling? Therapy can help you reconnect with your sense of wonder, because your back-to-school era can come at any age. I've said it before, and I'll say it again, I always recommend therapy to everybody, whether it be online or in person. This BetterHelp happens to be online. It's really convenient. I did do it for a little while, and I thought it was great. It's just super convenient, and that can be really beneficial in a lot of ways, depending on why you are visiting the therapist in the first place. In my case, it was a lot of anxiety, and having it at home, in the comfort of my own house, when I want, dressed as I want. It just alleviated some of the barriers of entry, I think, for me personally. So I would always recommend it. Like I say, it's very flexible. It's designed precisely for that, to fit to your schedule and be flexible. You fill out a brief questionnaire, you get matched with a licensed therapist, and you can switch at any time if you don't happen to get on with the therapist that you are matched with, and that's no additional charge. So if you are thinking of starting therapy, why not give BetterHelp a try? Rediscover your curiosity with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/darkhistories today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/darkhistories. Cheers. Welcome back. So yes, the story of George Albert Smith and his wife. I loved it. I thought this was such an interesting story. It was so entertaining to research. Firstly, I thought it was interesting that Edmund Gurney, the original guy that was investigating the ghost house, he has a really interesting story, which I didn't really go into. But basically, he was found dead, and he died of a chloroform overdose. He'd been prescribed this chloroform to treat his neuralgia. But some people said that, some guy wrote a book, I think 40s or 50s, that said that he thinks he killed himself. And he basically pinned it on George, which he said that because George had basically been falsifying some records, and he'd, about hypnotism and things like that, and that George's own act was essentially a hoax. This guy basically said that, he become disillusioned with the whole of his research into psychical affairs and decided to kill himself. This is quite a controversial take, though, which is why I didn't necessarily include it. I thought I'd just talk about it at the end. But it is interesting, say that this one sort of quite controversial opinion essentially pins this guy's suicide on George. It seems that it is quite a controversial opinion, and the way he kind of gets there is he jumps through a lot of hoops. He makes a lot of assumptions, so it's probably best to sort of ignore that anyway. But otherwise, I thought that George Albert Smith was generally a really great guy. I thought he seemed to be his whole life he seemed to want to just entertain. I thought what he did for the community in Brighton was amazing for the time, and it seemed that he was one of those people that, no matter what they did in life, it seemed to just work. He seemed to pioneer in so many areas. From the ghost hunting angle, his notes were really great to read. They're really rational. He approaches it from a really sort of logical angle, looks to explain everything first. He doesn't straight away jump to, oh my gosh, I heard a noise, it must be a ghost. Everything was always, he first went to finding an explanation that was, just natural phenomena. Interestingly, I actually thought he undersold his experience in the house a little bit. In his notes, he says that, that it was quite disappointing for him and that the 13 months spent there was fairly underwhelming. I think he actually saw a fair old bit of activity, quote unquote. I thought it was a really interesting time. I mean, the instruments playing was, certainly something. I guess he didn't see the apparitions that had been reported, but everything else was, I don't think he. Just the footsteps. I mean, that one description that he was saying about the brick tied to a string being dragged along the hallway, and I mean that would have been terrifying. But there you go. I think he sort of undersold that story a little bit. But yeah, I mean, for me, I personally thought it was a really interesting haunted house account. Actually, firstly, I thought all of the people's testimonies were terrifying. Especially the little girls saying that they saw the face of a pale face around the door, like poke their head around the door. And then the one about she saw it crawling towards her, like some sort of Sadako. Like, no, absolutely not. I thought they were really, I thought just about every testimony was terrifying, which is always what you want from a haunted house account, right? You want it to scare you. And I thought this was one of the more terrifying sort of haunted or ghost stories that Dark Issues covered, certainly for me. I don't know what you think. I guess when it comes to plausibility, I'm always difficult because you know my stance. I'm quite a fence sitter. I'm quite a skeptic. I guess I'm fairly agnostic in this sense. But I do think it has some interesting things that draw me to it. Firstly, the first two tenants to experience stuff seem to experience the same things but independently. Then they did meet up and they did talk to each other later. So you after that point, you have to disregard the similarities, right? Because they've talked about it. So that's that. It completely ruins the objectivity of that. But before that, they hadn't spoken to each other, and that's interesting, I think. Secondly, I do just find the testimonies. You're not going to say plausible, but I find them. They're not overly sensationalist, if you know what I mean. Like George's accounts, particularly, are say quite level-headed, and at no point does he sort of mention it being a ghost. He just says he just describes the noises. The apparitions, some of them are, they're a bit sort of kooky, but they don't overly sensationalize, and I think that often is a case with these sorts of things. So I feel that lends itself to it a bit. The fact that both of the tenants left pretty much. Well, the first tenant left after her aunt died, and but she did say she didn't enjoy living in the house. She said at one point that she never had a good day in the house. So essentially the ghost, I wouldn't say drove her out, but it helped, right? It helped her along. The second one, the ghost certainly drove her out, and not to her financial detriment, it drove her out. And so that's always interesting. Oftentimes when you see things like that, like ghosts driving them out, you often think, oh, well, they used the ghost as an excuse to end the tenancy early because of some other reason, etc. But not so in this case. Like, she was basically said to the landlord, I have to go, the house is haunted. Say, normally in these old cases, they often used ghosts as a way to end their tenancy early and break their contracts without having to pay. But in this case, the landlord basically turned around and said, I'm not bothered, you still got to pay. And so she ended up having to pay her way out. That's fairly interesting. I think perhaps more so, and I think what affects me the most with this case is, it's a good thing, but I think it affects my thinking of it, and it shouldn't really. But the fact that I was able to find in the newspaper the inquest report on the lady that had hung herself in the upstairs bedroom, that was amazing. That was like a real revelation for me. I love finding those things, like those little bits of research where you find something that actually backs up something that you've read in a primary source or whatever. So in this case, you read in like George's notes, and then he talks about this rumor of this lady having hung herself, and then you actually find the newspaper report that says it's true and that it was real. To be able to find that, I was so happy to find that. But at the same time, it did sort of strike a layer of sort of foreboding into the story for me, like almost like a tension, because suddenly it's like, wow, like this ghost could have been this lady who committed suicide. Now, of course, it doesn't make the haunting realistically any more or less likely just because I've found a report, of an inquest, just because someone did hang themselves, on the back of a door. That doesn't make a haunting any less or more likely unless you believe those things. But for some reason, it does tickle me a little bit. It does. It's a fallacy, but I guess it's still. I can't help it falling into that trap. I still found that it made me believe the case a little bit more. Whether or not I actually believe it, I don't know. Like I say, I'm up in the air. But I did think it was an excellent ghost story. I did think it was an excellent just story all round, really. I thought George's life was really interesting and I wanted to tell that anyway. But I thought it was an excellent ghost story. Whether or not it's true, that's anyone's guess, If you choose to believe it, why not? If you don't, fair enough. I think it's, it's one that I think will probably play a little in my mind. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed it anyway. I was really excited to do it with it being in my hometown. As I mentioned at the start, I've made a little video. It's just a fun little video of just showing off some of the locations in the episode. So it's just for a bit of fun. It's almost finished, and that will be going up on Patreon hopefully by Tuesday. So yeah, keep an eye out for that. Anyway, if you would like to contact me, whether about this story or anything else, you can do so. My email is contact@darkhistories.com. You can also contact me on any social media. All those links are in the show notes, as are links to darkhistories.com, which is like the main website for the podcast. You'll find all the links for everything there, including ways that you can contact me, ways that you can join the community over on Discord, the ways that you can support the show, merchandise, things like that. If you want to support, of course, that's really great help. If not, no worries. Podcast always going to be free. Always love making it. Just thanks very much for listening. Really, that's essentially just listening is support enough. So yeah, thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed it. As I say, I'll be back in a couple of weeks. So until then, take care, sleep tight.